with the American Congress ready to pass the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act. One of the biggest social media companies in the world is pushing back hard. Meta is threatening to remove news from its platforms altogether if Congress passes the law. Stick around to find out what the law is, why Meta is threatened by it, and what it might mean if they end up following through. We'll begin with a quick explainer on the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act. The world of journalism has gotten pretty tough over the years. While major publications like the New York Times and the Washington Post have managed to maintain a foothold in the changing landscape of reporting, smaller scale companies are struggling to compete. When it comes to small to medium-sized journalism companies, it's hard for local news outlets to compete with your Huffington Post and BuzzFeeds. A key reason why this is the case is that people don't get their news from newspapers anymore, and even TV consumption of news has gone down. Most people get their news through links that are either shared by others on social media or end up there through algorithms. The revenue potential of this kind of news sharing is quite minimal, and this is the thing that's holding smaller news outlets down. So the Senate bill, called the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act, has been proposed to Congress. All this act does is give the journalism industry 4 years of exemption from antitrust regulations. That would allow these companies to form blocks in order to get a stronger hand in negotiating some kind of compensation for the work they do. Social media companies like Meta, Twitter, and Google will be the hardest hit by this because they'll have to essentially pay these companies to be on their platforms. This bit of blackmail from Mark Zuckerberg's camp. Let's dig a little deeper into the actual concerns that Meta has about this law. The fact that people can get their news on Facebook and Instagram is a big part of why people use those platforms in the first place. Companies like these are all about user engagement. The longer they can keep you on their apps and websites, the more ads they can show you, and the more revenue they can earn. Now, in places like the US, you might still seek out news from primary or even secondary sources. However, in many parts of the world, Facebook has teamed up with telecom companies to present data plans where Facebook and maybe Instagram are whitelisted, meaning people can use them without taking a hit on their plan. In those countries, Facebook is the internet, and people get all of their information from Meta's platform. Is that a good thing? It probably isn't, but that's not the point. If this law were to pass, Meta would be caught between a rock and a hard place. In order to keep allowing news links on their services, they'd have to negotiate terms with the blocks that the companies would form, which would reduce their profits. On the other hand, telling these groups to talk to the hand means they wouldn't be allowed to host their content on their platform anymore, which would kill off one of the big incentives for users to use their platform in the first place. Also, here's what others have had to say about the bill. The News Media Alliance, a trade group made up of newspaper publishers, is obviously down for Congress to pass the bill. Their insistence is driven by the fact that local papers are in a precarious situation, and that a few more years of exploitation by big tech will spell the doom of the industry. The end result of that will be Facebook and its peers becoming America's de facto local newspaper. But there are special interest groups pushing back against the bill too, notably the American Civil Liberties Union, Public Knowledge, and the Computer and Communications Industry Association asked Congress not to pass the bill. Their argument is that exempting this industry from antitrust laws can give it a little too much power and exploit platforms back. Also, the bill doesn't account for what happens with the money that these companies will receive from their negotiations. Suppose the businesses pocket the money for themselves. That's a pretty good counter-argument, but the argument to that counter-argument is the News Media Bargaining Code. This is a piece of legislation in Australia that went into effect in March of last year and was probably an inspiration for this bill. Meta protested this by shutting down the Facebook newsfeed and bringing it back up. Platforms have played ball since, signing over 30 deals with media outlets that guaranteed them compensation. And would you look at that, the world hasn't ended because of it. Now, how worried should Meta be about this bill passing? Honestly, pretty worried. Ordinarily, the current Senate wouldn't be able to pass a bill like this, as Democratic Senator Amy Klobuchar would never be able to get a strong enough majority to pass it. But you know, this bill was actually proposed in Congress last year, and there's a reason why it's taken so long for them to actually talk about passing it.
You know, there's been a lot of focus on the electeds that day, but I remember the officers' faces. Scratches down their faces.
See, there's an annual defense bill coming up that has to pass. Since we're talking about the military, America would never think about passing this bill in limbo for the sake of shooting down Democrat-proposed legislation. So this has given the party an opportunity to get the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act passed. Stick this legislation as a rider to the defense bill and watch that thing fly through Congress. Lawmakers are still debating whether to go through with this, and there's a possibility that the finer points of the bill might be reworked, but the basic point will remain the same, which means Meta is gonna be in trouble either way. They also shouldn't expect this blackmail to help them all that much, since Meta shooting themselves in the foot doesn't threaten the US government in any way. If anything, Biden could probably get a lot of voters in the next election by bragging about the time he brought one of the most unpopular corporations in the world to its knees. Moving on, is this bill actually a good idea? We think it is. Local news outlets don't just present the news, they do important journalistic work about issues that matter to their audiences. The local newspaper is willing to cover stories that may not be the most sensational and won't get as many clicks and views, but are still important to the people reading. Even larger news outlets rely heavily on the work of local newspapers, driving the country's attention to smaller stories that may be of interest on a national level. The kind of news that's threatening to replace local news can't do what this industry is doing right now. As David Simon, creator of The Wire and veteran of the Baltimore Sun's City Desk, once said, "We won't be able to rest easy about the state of journalism until these trendy online outlets are out there covering zoning board meetings and the like. Boring as those might be, they're still important news."
That's what's going on there is exactly what I've been talking about. It was really remarkable. And if I put my little dramatist hat on,
Now, the ACLU might have a point about giving too much power to the local news industry. If you ask us, that doesn't mean that the act should be balled up and thrown in the trash though. Congress should instead dive into the act and comprehensively define the terms of the antitrust immunity that the journalism industry is getting. While they're at it, they should also create legal stipulations for how companies can spend the money they receive. And finally, what do we make of Meta's protests? In arguing against the act, Meta points out that social media platforms aren't just taking money without offering value to the news outlets. After all, without Meta's platforms and others, you might not stumble upon the ones that can afford marketing or search engine optimization. According to the company, they ought to be able to benefit as much as possible from the current arrangement for just that reason. But we've seen over the past decade, Meta is ending up with such a big slice of the pie that news outlets are struggling to survive. The revenue balance has to be adjusted in a way that both news outlets and social platforms can thrive. That's exactly what Australia did, and it looks like things are working out pretty great for them. You'll notice that the only reason you're even hearing about the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act is because Meta is kicking up a stink about it. There are other companies with social platforms that'll be affected by this, and they haven't even released a public statement about them. When Elon Musk is staying quiet on an issue, you know that there's no room for argument there. It's possible that Meta is particularly worried about this, because the company has lost like 70% of its share value in the past year. But that's not really the journalism industry's problem, is it? And with that, that's it for our video today. What do you think of the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act? Do you think Congress needs to make any changes to it? Or is it good to go as is? And do you have any sympathy at all for Meta's position? We know that it's hard to feel anything for Mark Zuckerberg at this point, but we gotta try. Drop your answers in the comment section below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.